The night glittered with wealth, vanity, and the promise of scandal. Inside the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, every inch of the space whispered extravagance. Crystal chandeliers dripped golden light over silk-draped tables adorned with towering floral arrangements. The faint notes of a string quartet swirled through the air like champagne bubbles, elegant yet calculated to impress. This wasn't just any wedding, it was the wedding of the season. And all eyes, even the ones pretending not to stare, were fixed on the bride. She was a vision in custom couture, her gown shimmering like liquid starlight as she glided across the polished marble floor. Every step seemed choreographed to perfection, each smile measured for cameras and gossip columns alike. After all, she wasn't merely a woman celebrating love, she was a socialite securing her throne, finally marrying the man she believed to be worthy of her ambition. Or so it seemed. But beneath the sheen of luxury, tension ran like an undercurrent. Whispers snaked through the crowd, hushed but eager. Guests leaned close, disguising their curiosity behind jeweled fans and champagne flutes. "Did you hear? He came." The name wasn't spoken aloud, yet everyone knew who he was. The billionaire, the one she had left behind. The man she had once been engaged to, until her hunger for status and spectacle pulled her in another direction. His presence was shocking, his audacity to appear in the very place where his humiliation was meant to be cemented even more so. And then, he arrived. Tall, commanding, and impossible to ignore, he slipped into the ballroom as though he owned it, though technically, he could have bought the entire building without denting his fortune. The chatter intensified. What's he doing here? Is he here to cause a scene? How deliciously scandalous. He didn't flinch under the scrutiny. Instead, he wore confidence like a tailored suit. Yet those who knew him well, if anyone truly did, could sense something sharper beneath his composure, a purpose in his stride. It was then that another presence shifted the entire room's focus. She entered quietly, without the glitter of jewels or the arrogance of entitlement. A black woman, dressed in elegant simplicity, the kind of grace that didn't need embellishment. Her gown, though understated, carried a quiet sophistication that rivaled the bride's extravagance in its authenticity. She moved as though she belonged, though it was clear to many guests that she did not come from their polished world of old money and endless privilege. Eyes turned, curious, assessing. Who was she? A date? A distraction? A statement? Even the bride faltered for a moment, her perfect smile tightening at the edges. This woman, in her calm and unassuming presence, somehow managed to command more attention than the diamonds scattered across the room. And though she spoke not a word, there was an air of mystery that wrapped around her like a veil. What no one knew, yet, was that her secret would not only change the course of the evening but rewrite the story that the bride, the billionaire, and every guest thought they understood. He had told himself 100 reasons not to come, and yet here he was. The billionaire, a man who had built empires from scratch and turned obstacles into stepping stones, had never felt the sting of failure as sharply as when his ex-fiancée had walked away. She hadn't just left him, she had abandoned the life they had planned together, exchanging it for the shallow promise of prestige and a groom who looked better on the society pages. His pride, though rarely wounded, still bore the scar. As he stood near the edge of the ballroom, his gaze cut through the glittering chaos. Every laugh, every clink of crystal seemed rehearsed, as though the entire wedding were nothing more than a performance staged to remind him of what he had lost. But beneath the hurt, there lingered something else, a desire to confront the past, to show her, and everyone else watching, that she had not destroyed him. If anything, her betrayal had forged something colder, sharper. He hadn't come merely as a spectator. He had come with intent. For weeks, he had wrestled with the decision, the line between pettiness and justice blurring in his mind. He did not need revenge, money had already placed him beyond the reach of most insults, but he craved a moment of reckoning. He wanted her to see him not as the man she had discarded, but as the man she could never diminish. And then, there was her. The woman who had entered the ballroom quietly, carrying herself with a dignity that neither the jewels nor the gowns of the others could imitate. He had noticed her immediately. In a sea of pretension, she was authenticity. While others postured, she simply was. Something about her presence stirred his curiosity, almost as though fate had guided her into the room at the precise moment he needed an ally, or perhaps a mirror. His mind was made up in a single, daring thought. If his ex-fiancée had wanted to display her triumph over him before the world, he would answer with a gesture bold enough to unnerve her, but graceful enough to cloak it as charm. He would ask this mysterious woman to dance. As he crossed the ballroom toward her, time seemed to slow. Conversations faltered. Glasses paused mid-air. Every pair of eyes followed him, their whispers quick to rise. What is he doing? Surely not with her. This is madness. The room had lived off gossip for years, but tonight he fed it something far more intoxicating, scandal wrapped in elegance. When he stopped before the woman, silence rippled outward like a wave. He extended his hand, his expression unreadable, his tone smooth but deliberate. May I have this dance? For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The woman studied him with eyes that carried depth, not dazed by his wealth or reputation, but thoughtful, as though weighing something more significant. Then, with the faintest curve of her lips, she placed her hand in his. The music swelled again, but now it had a new rhythm, charged and daring. As they moved to the center of the floor, disapproval flickered across painted faces. Some guests sneered, others leaned closer, eager to watch the unfolding drama. The whispers grew sharper. How insulting to the bride. Does he mean to humiliate her? And the bride herself, oh, her reaction was impossible to ignore. Her eyes, once sparkling with triumph, darkened with fury. She tightened her grip on her new husband's arm, but her smile could no longer mask her disdain. Each twirl, each graceful step of the dance, seemed to chip away at her carefully curated image. The billionaire didn't need to speak to her. His message was already delivered with every movement. You thought you had one. But the story is not yours to control. The moment their hands met, the ballroom transformed. The string quartet, sensing the sudden shift in energy, seemed to play with more intensity, their notes filling the silence left by stunned whispers. He led her to the center of the floor with the assuredness of a man who had danced through boardrooms and hostile takeovers. She followed, her steps measured yet fluid, each movement graceful without being ostentatious. Together, they glided as though the space had been cleared just for them. His confidence framed her elegance, and though they had never danced before, their bodies seemed to anticipate each other's rhythm. It wasn't just a performance, it was an unspoken dialogue. The billionaire's eyes lingered on her, searching for answers to questions he hadn't yet formed. Hers, however, darted occasionally, guarded, as though she carried a secret too heavy to let slip in her gaze. The effect on the room was undeniable. Conversations halted, laughter died, and soon the only sound beyond the music was the murmur of curiosity. Who is she? One guest hissed behind a jeweled clutch. Why her? Another demanded, fanning herself nervously as though the answer might be scandalous enough to ignite the room. Some looked impressed, others appalled, but none could look away. The bride's composure faltered with each graceful turn. Though she kept her smile plastered for the sake of appearances, her jaw clenched whenever their eyes met across the dance floor. She had expected him to sulk in a corner, invisible against her triumph. Instead, he had claimed the night spotlight with a woman who, by every shallow measure of that crowd, did not belong. And that stung worse than any insult. The bride's new husband, oblivious to the nuances of social warfare, attempted to console her with whispered reassurances. But she heard none of it. Her gaze was locked on the woman, seething with jealousy. It wasn't merely that another woman stood where she had once stood. It was that this woman commanded attention without effort, without wealth, without reputation. It was the kind of power she herself could never manufacture. Meanwhile, on the dance floor, the billionaire leaned in just slightly, enough for his voice to carry over the music. "You're handling this well," he murmured, his tone both amused and probing. The woman tilted her head, a soft smile brushing her lips, but her eyes betrayed nothing. "I've learned to handle many things." The simplicity of her reply intrigued him more than any flattery could. She wasn't dazzled by him, nor did she seem eager to play along with the spectacle he had created. Instead, she held herself with quiet strength, as though she was aware of something far larger than the whispers surrounding them. And still, she remained guarded. Her smiles were fleeting, her laughter carefully restrained, as though she were constantly weighing what could and could not be revealed. To the billionaire, It was intoxicating. To the guests, it was infuriating. To the bride, it was unbearable. By the time the music swelled to its final notes, it was clear to everyone in the room that this was no ordinary dance. It was a storm in the making, two lives colliding under the scrutiny of hundreds, while one woman's secret simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to ignite. Long before she found herself on the polished marble of the city's most exclusive ballroom, she had walked far harsher paths. Her story was not one of privilege or glittering soirees. It was built on resilience, carved out of struggle, and defined by the strength she was forced to summon again and again. She had grown up in a part of the city most of tonight's guests had only ever passed in chauffeured cars, their tinted windows shielding them from reality. Life there was a constant negotiation between dreams and survival. She had watched her mother work multiple jobs to keep the lights on, her hands blistered and weary, but her spirit unbroken. From her, the woman inherited grit, the kind that allowed her to face rejection without crumbling and to endure cruelty without losing her dignity. Discrimination had shadowed her at every turn. Teachers had doubted her abilities, employers had dismissed her potential, and doors had closed simply because of the color of her skin. But each time, she found another door, another way forward. She had worked harder than anyone else, excelling in spaces designed to exclude her. She had learned to smile when insulted, to steady her voice when dismissed, and to rise every time the world tried to push her down. Her perseverance eventually led her into circles she once thought unreachable. She built a career quietly, steadily, not with shortcuts or scandals but with relentless effort. Still, she never forgot what it felt like to be underestimated. That memory gave her both humility and steel. It was this combination that made her stand out. Even in a ballroom filled with diamonds and designer gowns, her presence carried the weight of authenticity. But why was she here, at this wedding, in the midst of people who looked at her as though she were an uninvited guest? The answer was not simple. She had not come to bask in luxury or to play a part in someone else's spectacle. She had been invited, though not by the bride, who would have scoffed at the very idea. Her invitation had come quietly, indirectly, through connections that hinted at a history not many in the room could imagine. There had been a time, years ago, when her path had brushed against the billionaire's. He had not known it then, not fully, but she had seen him from the edges of his world. Perhaps it was a fleeting encounter, perhaps something deeper. But their stories had overlapped in ways that left her carrying knowledge she had never revealed. And though she kept her composure now, the memory of that unspoken connection burned faintly in her mind as she danced with him. Hints of that past clung to her presence tonight, though no one else could see them. The way she held herself with calm in the face of scrutiny, the quiet confidence that rivaled even the billionaire's own, it was born not just of survival but of knowing she carried a truth none of these people suspected. To the casual observer, she was a mystery, a woman who did not belong but refused to shrink. To those who truly looked, she was more than that. She was a survivor who had endured storms most of these glittering guests would never face. She was proof that resilience could shine brighter than wealth. And though her secret connection to the man leading her across the dance floor remained hidden, it gave her strength. For she knew that when the time came, her truth would not just surprise them, it would change everything. From across the ballroom, the bride's smile was polished to perfection, but behind her glittering facade boiled a storm of bitterness. Every eye should have been fixed on her tonight. Her gown, her vows, her carefully orchestrated fairytale. Instead, the moment the billionaire had stepped onto the dance floor with her, the spotlight shifted. And the bride felt it like a slap across the face. Humiliation was something she had never tolerated. Her life had been built on appearances, on ensuring that envy followed her wherever she went. Every outfit, every public gesture, every whispered rumor was curated to remind the world that she was untouchable. Yet here, on what was meant to be the crowning moment of her social ascent, she was being upstaged by a woman whose name most of the guests didn't even know. Her jaw tightened as memories resurfaced, uninvited and cruel. She remembered the day she had walked away from the billionaire. Back then, he had been devoted, generous, and infuriatingly loyal. But she had wanted more than loyalty. She had wanted status, endless admiration, and the kind of power that came not from love but from spectacle. He had refused to play the puppet in her theater of appearances, and that refusal had been enough. So she had broken him, trading genuine affection for a man who fit better in glossy magazines. Now, watching him command the floor with another woman, she questioned that choice for the first time. His confidence, his deliberate act of defiance, it mocked her. Worse, the woman beside him radiated something the bride could never imitate: authenticity. No matter how many jewels she draped herself in, she could not replicate that quiet, natural power. The bride's fingers dug into her champagne flute, her manicured nails biting into crystal. She could not let this stand. The whispers already stung. She looks threatened. Doesn't the other woman seem so composed? It was unbearable. Her decision hardened like glass. She would not allow herself to be overshadowed in her own kingdom. If the billionaire thought parading this stranger across her stage would rattle her, he was mistaken. She would find a way to remind everyone who she was. And as for the woman, this interloper who had stolen attention so effortlessly, she would be put back in her place before the night was over. The dance ended, but the ripples it created spread quickly through the ballroom like cracks in porcelain. The guests were divided, each whisper carrying judgment or fascination. Some leaned into admiration, their eyes sparkling with mischief. "Well, at least he knows how to make an entrance," one woman chuckled, clearly entertained by the audacity. A few younger attendees even applauded quietly, charmed by the defiance and the mysterious elegance of the black woman. But admiration was not the dominant note. Far louder were the whispers of disdain. "Who does she think she is?" hissed a guest draped in emeralds. Another wrinkled her nose. "This is a wedding, not a social experiment." Their words were sharper than knives, dripping with the entitlement of people who believed access to such spaces was their birthright. Beneath their critiques lingered an uglier truth: racism and classism, veiled just enough to pass as gossip. It wasn't merely that she was a stranger, it was that she wasn't their kind. Through it all, the billionaire stood like an immovable pillar beside her. His presence alone silenced many who might have spoken louder. His hand remained steady at the small of her back, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. She was not to be dismissed, not tonight. And every time he shifted slightly toward her, every time his gaze lingered with a kind of protective intensity, the curiosity of the crowd deepened. Who was this woman, to command such loyalty from him? At the head table, the bride's family exchanged uneasy glances. Their legacy had been built on spotless reputation, on carefully maintained alliances. To have this spectacle erupt at their daughter's wedding was an embarrassment they could not ignore. Leaning toward the bride, her mother whispered sharply, "You cannot let this continue. People will talk." Her father's voice followed, low and authoritative. "Control the narrative. If you don't, he will." The bride nodded, her nails biting into her palm beneath the tablecloth. They were right. Already, she could feel her carefully woven fairytale unraveling thread by thread. The night that was supposed to prove her superiority had turned into a question mark, and the woman beside her ex threatened to become the exclamation point. It didn't take long for the whispers to evolve into direct confrontations. A few of the bolder guests, emboldened by champagne and the false confidence of social standing, approached the woman with smiles too sharp to be genuine. One woman, wrapped in pearls that gleamed like armor, tilted her head with mock sweetness. "You dance beautifully. Did you train somewhere, dear? Or is it just natural?" The pause between her words made her meaning clear. "You don't belong here, so how could you possibly move with such grace?" The woman smiled softly, her voice even and warm. "I've learned to adapt to many rooms, whether I was invited into them or not." Her words, delivered without malice, struck sharper than any insult. The pearl-draped woman blinked, forced into silence. Another man joined in, his chuckle carrying condescension. "Tell me, how exactly did you meet our dear billionaire friend? I imagine it must have been unusual." His tone dripped with insinuation, a question meant to reduce her presence to scandal. Her gaze remained steady. Life has a way of crossing paths where you least expect. Sometimes in places you'd rather forget, sometimes in places you never thought you'd belong. She lifted her glass, unbothered, as though she were discussing the weather. It was that poise, so calm, so unshakable, that began to unsettle the crowd. For all their wealth and polish, many of them lacked the ability to withstand scrutiny without flinching. Yet she seemed immune to their barbs, answering with dignity, neither defensive nor deferential. It made her presence more intriguing, not less. But it wasn't just her composure that raised eyebrows, it was the details she let slip. In a conversation overheard by several guests, she commented idly on the ballroom's decor, noting, "The last time they renovated this place, they almost replaced the chandeliers with crystal tiers from Milan, but the board voted it down." Only someone familiar with the venue's elite inner workings would know such specifics. Later, when a guest mentioned the bride's family estate, she remarked softly, "Ah yes, the garden near the east wing. The roses never took root there, no matter how many times they tried." The remark was casual, but it carried the weight of familiarity. Too familiar. The billionaire, standing nearby, caught every word. His curiosity, already piqued by her presence, sharpened into something keener. How could she know details even he had forgotten? He studied her face, her composure, searching for recognition in features that felt both new and oddly familiar. She was no stranger, not entirely. As the evening pressed on, more fragments surfaced. A slip of knowledge about a family feud kept quiet for years. A detail about his ex's preferences, spoken with the certainty of someone who had seen them firsthand. Each revelation was small, but together they painted a picture that unsettled him. This woman wasn't just a bold guest. She was tethered to his world in ways he could not yet define. The ex-bride noticed too. With every passing moment, her unease grew. What began as irritation over stolen attention twisted into something darker, fear. Because if this woman truly knew the things she hinted at, then her presence wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. The billionaire's suspicion deepened, his mind racing. She had accepted his hand for a dance, responded with elegance to cruelty, and now she was unraveling truths hidden beneath years of silence. Whoever she was, she carried a secret large enough to shake the very foundations of the room. And though the guests didn't yet realize it, the air had shifted. Something was coming, something that would turn whispers into gasps and elegance into chaos. It was inevitable. The tension that had been simmering all night finally reached a boil. The bride, her patience shredded by the stares and whispers, rose from her seat and cut across the ballroom with a grace that was brittle at the edges. Her gown shimmered like moonlight, but her expression was anything but serene. Every step she took was a declaration. She would reclaim control, no matter the cost. She stopped just short of the black woman, her smile stretched tight, her voice sweetened with venom. "What an interesting performance," she said, glancing at the billionaire before returning her gaze to the woman. "I must commend your courage. Not everyone would dare to upstage a bride on her wedding night." The woman's eyes lifted, calm and steady, her smile small but genuine. "I don't believe grace has anything to do with upstaging. It simply shines where it chooses." The bride's jaw stiffened. Her words were meant to sting, to humiliate, but instead they had been turned into an unintended compliment. Around them, guests leaned closer, pretending to sip champagne while savoring every syllable. The bride tried again, her voice sharper. "I suppose some people thrive on attention, especially when it doesn't belong to them. But then again, some people are always reaching for things they cannot have." The woman's posture didn't shift. She stood as though rooted in her dignity. "And some people," she replied softly, "confuse possessions with people, as though love were a prize to be displayed rather than a truth to be lived." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bride's smile faltered, her carefully curated image cracking. Her cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment but from rage. The billionaire stood between them, his gaze darting from one to the other. He had seen his ex's temper before, sharp enough to cut through silk, but what fascinated him was the woman's composure. She parried each insult without raising her voice, without losing her poise, as though she had nothing to fear. That calmness unsettled him, but it also intrigued him. What truth gave her such power? Finally, the bride abandoned pretense. Her voice dropped, low and biting. "Who are you, really? You walk in here like you belong, but you don't. You don't belong in this world, not tonight, not ever. So tell me, what's your game? What are you hiding?" For the first time, the woman's smile faded. Not into fear, but into something sharper, resolve. She met the bride's glare head-on, unflinching. "I'm hiding nothing," she said quietly, her words carrying further than any shout. "But perhaps it is you who fears the truth being seen." The ballroom went still, the air thick with anticipation. The bride's fury burned, the billionaire's curiosity blazed, and the woman's calm stood unbroken. Whatever truth lingered on her tongue, it was powerful enough to unsettle them all. And soon, it would no longer be hidden. The silence that followed her last words was deafening. The ballroom, once alive with the hum of violins and idle chatter, now felt like a stage frozen before the climax of a play. All eyes were on her. The bride's fury burned in her sharp breaths, the billionaire's curiosity sharpened into near desperation, and the guests leaned forward, hungry for the scandal they knew was about to erupt. The woman took a breath, not hurried, not hesitant, but steady, like someone who had waited years for this moment. Her voice was calm, each syllable measured, carrying the weight of truth. "You ask who I am," she said, her gaze locked on the bride, "but perhaps the better question is who you are, without the lies you've built around yourself." Gasps echoed like a wave. The bride's face blanched, but the woman pressed on. "Your family knows me," she continued, her tone unwavering. "Though they'd rather pretend they don't. Years ago, I lived in the shadows of your world. My mother worked for your household, cooking meals you never tasted, cleaning messes you pretended weren't yours. I grew up hearing your laughter in those hallways while I scrubbed your floors. I was invisible to you then. And yet, even as a child, I saw the cruelty you and your friends carried like crowns." The bride stiffened, her fingers curling into fists. Murmurs spread across the room as guests tried to reconcile the revelation with the flawless image they had worshipped. But the woman wasn't finished. She turned slightly, her eyes finding the billionaire. There was a softness now, something fragile beneath her steel. "And then there was you. You don't remember, but we crossed paths once, years ago, when you visited their estate. I was only a girl, too young, too hidden. But you were the first person who looked at me as though I mattered. It was a moment so small to you, perhaps, but it lit something in me. That memory has never left me." The billionaire's breath caught. His mind clawed back through the years, searching, and suddenly he remembered, a fleeting encounter, a young girl carrying books into the study, her eyes bright though she remained silent. He hadn't thought of it in decades, yet now the memory struck him like lightning. The bride's mask cracked further. "This is absurd," she spat, her voice trembling. "She's spinning stories to embarrass me. None of this." But the woman's voice cut through hers, stronger now. "Is it absurd that your family forbade me from attending the same schools, though I had the grades? That they silenced me when I tried to speak of what I'd seen? Or is it absurd that they threatened me when I discovered the truth about you, about the schemes, the betrayals, the lies you built to climb higher?" A hush fell, then broke into shocked gasps. Heads turned toward the bride, her parents paling at the edges of the crowd. The woman's eyes gleamed with conviction. "You built your image on deception. And when I would not stay silent, you made sure I was erased from your world. But I am here now, and I will not be silenced again." The bride stumbled back a step, her composure unraveling before hundreds of eyes. The whispers turned venomous, not toward the woman but toward her. "Is it true? Did she really? All these years?" The billionaire's chest tightened, not with anger, but with awe. The woman before him was no longer just a mystery guest. She was truth incarnate, standing tall where she had once been forced to bow. His respect for her deepened into something fiercer, sharper, something dangerously close to reverence. The bride, trembling with rage and humiliation, tried to lash out one final time. "You're nothing. You're still nothing." But the billionaire's voice thundered over hers, firm and resolute. "Enough." The word silenced the room. He stepped toward the woman, his eyes locked on hers, the truth finally dawning. She wasn't just a disruption. She was the reminder of everything real he had once lost and the embodiment of the strength he now craved beside him. The bride's perfect image shattered before them all, her triumph dissolving into ashes. And in its place, the woman stood radiant, not in jewels or gowns, but in undeniable truth. The ballroom had never known silence so heavy. The chandeliers glittered as though mocking the stillness, their golden light falling on faces frozen in disbelief. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The bride's ragged breaths were the only sound, sharp and shallow, betraying her unraveling composure. The guests, who only hours before had judged the black woman with sneers and dismissive whispers, now shifted uneasily in their seats. The dignity with which she had carried herself, the truth she had revealed, and the courage that burned in her words, all of it forced them to reconsider. The once dismissed stranger had become the moral center of the night, a mirror reflecting their own shallow biases. Murmurs turned into reluctant respect, admiration blooming where scorn had been. The bride, however, was beyond saving. Her perfect wedding, meant to showcase her victory, had become the stage of her undoing. Her gown, her jewels, her polished smile, all were powerless against the weight of her humiliation. The image she had so carefully built cracked apart under the stares of her own friends and allies. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to be seen siding with her. Others shook their heads, dismayed by the truth she could no longer hide. At the center of it all, the billionaire made his choice. He stepped forward, closing the space between himself and the woman, his presence a shield against the hostile stares that still lingered. His eyes, once clouded with pride and bitterness, now held clarity. He looked at her as though truly seeing her for the first time, not as a mystery, not as a scandal, but as a force. The bride saw it too, and the realization was a dagger. In the span of one evening, she had lost more than her carefully curated reputation. She had lost him, entirely and irrevocably. The billionaire extended his hand, not as a performance, not as a statement, but as a choice. And when the woman placed her hand in his, the power in the room shifted. The guests, sensing the tide had turned, rose in uneasy applause. It was not for the bride, not for the wedding. It was for the woman who had refused to be silenced, and for the man who finally had the courage to stand beside her. The music, forgotten in the storm of revelation, swelled again. Soft, hesitant at first, as though the orchestra itself sensed the shift in the room. The billionaire turned toward the woman, his hand still holding hers, his eyes carrying a quiet intensity. "Dance with me," he said, not as a spectacle, not as an act of defiance, but as a simple, heartfelt request. She hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of everything that had just unfolded pressing heavily on her chest. Yet when she looked into his eyes, she saw no trace of pity or condescension, only respect, an equal's invitation. Slowly, she nodded, allowing him to lead her back to the center of the floor. This dance was not like the first. The first had been charged with tension, a weapon wielded to unsettle the bride and intrigue the guests. But now, as the billionaire pulled her gently into his arms, there was no performance, only presence. Every movement, every step, every turn spoke of reclamation. This was no longer about appearances or revenge. It was about rewriting the narrative in front of those who had doubted her. Around them, the crowd shifted. At first, the guests watched in silence, still grappling with the whiplash of the evening. But as the couple moved, her grace matched by his steady strength, something shifted. Where once there had been mockery, admiration began to bloom. Applause rose tentatively, then stronger, rippling across the ballroom. The sound filled the space like absolution, acknowledging the dignity she had defended and the equality they now embodied together. The bride sat motionless at the edge of the room, her humiliation stark against the beauty unfolding at the center. She had sought to make the night hers alone, but the story now belonged to another woman, a woman who had been underestimated, dismissed, and yet had emerged radiant, unbroken. As the song reached its crescendo, the billionaire tightened his hold, his gaze never leaving hers. It was as if, in that dance, they were making a vow, not to the crowd, not even to the past, but to each other. When the music ended and he pressed a quiet kiss to her hand, the applause thundered louder, sealing the moment in memory. The dance was no longer about scandal. It was about love reclaimed, dignity restored, and a truth that could no longer be silenced. As the applause softened and the music faded into silence, the woman felt her chest rise and fall with the weight of the night. Hours ago, she had stepped into this ballroom an outsider, a guest no one expected to matter, a figure dismissed with judgmental stares and whispers. Now she stood in the center of it all, not because of the dress she wore or the hand she held, but because she had revealed her truth and refused to be diminished. She thought back to the years of invisibility, of walking through polished hallways unseen, of working harder than anyone only to be disregarded, of living with the sting of prejudice pressed against her skin like a permanent brand. Yet tonight had proven that silence was not her destiny. She had spoken, and in speaking, she had shifted the very ground beneath her feet. No longer an outsider, she had carved her place into the story. Beside her, the billionaire studied her with an expression that blended awe and something deeper, something tender. For him, this night had stripped away illusions. He had walked into the wedding carrying bitterness, wounded pride, and the weight of betrayal. He had intended to make a statement, to rattle his ex's carefully crafted facade. But instead, he had been confronted with a greater truth. Love was not about performance, wealth, or appearances. Love was about courage, the courage to see someone fully, to stand beside them even when the world scoffed, to choose dignity over spectacle. The ex, meanwhile, sat diminished in her glittering gown, her crown of arrogance toppled by the very woman she had sought to humiliate. Her downfall was more than social embarrassment, it was a reminder of what cruelty costs. She had built her life on appearances, on dismissing others to elevate herself. Now, before the same crowd she had sought to impress, she was laid bare, her cruelty exposed, her triumph dissolved into ashes. The ballroom, once a battlefield, now felt like a stage for renewal. The guests no longer whispered with disdain but with wonder, as if they knew they had witnessed something they would retell for years. For them, the evening scandal had become a lesson about power, not the kind found in titles or fortunes, but the kind forged in resilience and truth. As the doors of the grand hall opened, the billionaire offered his arm. She accepted, not as a rescued outsider, but as an equal. Together they walked out, heads held high, their silhouettes framed against the golden light spilling from the chandeliers. They weren't merely leaving a wedding, they were stepping into a future rewritten, their steps echoing like a promise. And as the night closed behind them, the truth of it all lingered. The dance that began as a scandal became the moment that changed everything.